Imagine you're an activist trying to expose corruption in public welfare scheme. You file an RTI, hoping to access a list of beneficiaries to see if the money actually reached those in need. Earlier, you'd often get the information because the law required officials to consider if public interest outweighed privacy. But today, with the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023, India's first full-fledged privacy law, your odds have suddenly changed. All a government office has to do now is that call the information personal data and your request could be flatly denied. Let's talk about a major shakeup that's just hit the heart of India's digital and democratic landscape. The new Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023, or DPDP as we call it.
Now the Right to Information Act, after these amendments, simply reads as that information which relates to personal information shall henceforth not be disclosed.
With the government notifying final rules this November, India's first full-fledged digital privacy law has been enforced. This law claims to give Indians more control over their personal data, how it's collected, stored, and used, while also setting tough standards for organizations and government bodies handling such data. On paper, it very well sounds like a win-win for citizens. More privacy, better security, and the kind of rules that bring us closer to the global data protection standards. But as always, the full story is a little bit more complicated. Critics, including several voices from the media and civil society, are raising red flags. They argue that it represents a direct attack on transparency.
Now, I have looked at thousands of RTIs. I myself would have filed hundreds and thousands of RTIs. And literally in every single RTI, some level of personal information is always asked for because that is what leads to accountability.
If you can't check who's benefiting from public schemes or scrutinize the wealth and conduct of those in power, how do you challenge corruption or inefficiency? The danger is clear. Privacy is vital, but too broad and unchecked, an exemption can become a shield for abuse and opacity.
In the rush to protect privacy, we must not allow privacy to become a shield for corruption or a shield for evading public accountability.
To understand the implications of this act, I spoke to Amrita Johri. She is a social activist and member of Satark Nagrik Sangathan, known for her work on the right to information and right to food campaigns. A strong advocate for transparency and accountability in governance. She is also the co-author of Tilting the Balance of Power, Advocating the RTI Act, which examines the implementation and challenges of India's transparency law. Listen in. Hi Amrita, my first question to you is that what was the original RTI Act for our viewers to understand what the basic act was and how that will be impacted? We will get to that later on, but I would really want you to start with what was the original RTI Act and how did it come about?
Yeah. So the Right to Information Act is a landmark legislation that came nationally in 2005. And essentially, it guarantees people the right to access information from public authorities. Now, this is in furtherance of the constitutional right guaranteed to us under Article 19(1)(a), which is the right to free speech and expression. And over several decades, starting from the 1960s, the Supreme Court, in a plethora of judgments, actually ruled that an essential part of the right to free speech is the right to information. So in a sense, saying it's a right to informed speech, that it is only when you have information that can you actually have informed speech, can you in a sense be analytical, critical, because an essential part of free speech is also being critical of government policies, government actions, and all of that is only possible when you have the right to information. So even much before the Right to Information Act came as a legislation, we already had the recognition that the right to information is a fundamental right. Now, why did we need a law? We needed a specific law to operationalize that right. That even though Supreme Court has said, yes, you have the right to information, it flows from the Constitution. How do I actually get information? Who do I go and file an application to? What information can be given to me? What information can be denied to me? If I don't get information, where can I file an appeal? What are the incentives and disincentives over the on the government if there are violations of the law. So for all of this, we needed a law. Now, even before the Right to Information Act came at a national level through Parliament, we had several states which brought about Right to Information Act, and Delhi is one of those states where I live and I work as well. And that, in a sense, gave a lot of experience to the whole people's movement that was at that point demanding a strong framework to say that, okay, what are the aspects that work and what are the aspects that don't work? And the interesting thing about India's Right to Information law is that it came on the back of a people's movement in which ordinary people were also participating. So, along with journalists, professors, intellectuals, social scientists, you also had common people articulating why information was important for them. So, whether it was about the fact that, look, when we don't get our ration supplies from the government and we go and ask why it's not coming, we are just told, oh, government has stopped giving you. But we actually want to see those records. Or when people working on government programs, there were at that point there was a drought in several states and people were working on government programs and they were not being paid their wages because they were told you're not actually showing up for work. So they said, show us a copy of that attendance register. So, this day-to-day articulation of need for information, not just by researchers or activists or academics, but by common people. And that's why if you look at the Right to Information law in India, the way it's worded, its provisions, and this I'm now talking prior to the amendments, it has actually been held to be in global rankings always among the top legislations in the world. So there is this organization called Center for Law and Democracy, which does these rankings, and consistently prior to these amendments and prior to the 2019 amendments, the Indian law was always top of the ranks. And the reason was that the way it's framed, the way it's worded, A, it takes into account people's concerns. B, the information that is exempt is very precise and concise and doesn't allow for very wide exemptions. And C, the independence of the appellate mechanism. Now, the point is that even much before Puttaswamy judgment, which held right to privacy to also be a fundamental right, the Right to Information Act already recognized the principle of privacy. So the Right to Information Act says that all information is to be given to citizens other than the exemptions contained in Section 8 and Section 9 of the RTI Act. And in Section 8, there are provisions like information which would harm, say, national security, information which would adversely impact a fiduciary relationship, then information which has been expressly forbidden by the courts that you cannot disclose this. And then there was Section 81J of the Right to Information Act, which actually recognized privacy, but also found a perfect balance between privacy and transparency. So what 81J said was that information which relates to personal information, the disclosure of which has no relationship to any public activity or public interest, or which would cause unwarranted invasion of privacy of an individual, only that information was exempt. So it recognizes the need to withhold information, certain personal information due to privacy concerns, but it's very explicit in saying that only a subset of personal information can be exempt. What is that subset? That is personal information which should have nothing to do with public activity or interest. Now, let me give you an example. Let us say the assets and liabilities of a person. Now, suppose someone files an RTI and asks for your or my assets and liabilities. We might argue, look, we're private citizens. Why are you interested in our personal information? It looks like a vicarious exercise that you're doing. But suppose you and I are public officials. Let's say I'm the SDM of a district. Let's say I'm the judge. Let's say I'm an elected representative. I'm an IAS officer. Then that personal information could have a link to public activity or public interest, because it could be that one of the ways that you prove corruption in India is if your assets are disproportionate to your known sources of income. And therefore someone might argue that because she's a public official, therefore there's a link of this personal information to public activity. So in essence, under the pre-amendment 81J, if the government wanted to deny information citing 81J, they had to prove three things. They had to say that, look, this is personal information which has nothing to do with public activity. Then they had to say this is personal information which has nothing to do with public interest. And also, they had to prove that this is personal information of a nature where unwarranted invasion of privacy will be caused. So it was a very high threshold, but a very, very good balance. So, because also we need to understand that the phrase personal information is a very, very wide ranging phrase. It even includes people's names. So it includes people's addresses. So something like, let's say, the disclosure of the voter list. Actually, 100 crore people who are voters in this country, their names, their addresses, where do they live, who do they live with, husband, wife, father, mother, brother, sister, children, all of that is available in the public domain. Now, someone might say, oh my God, that's a huge breach of privacy. No, but there's a reason, there's a huge public interest because the world over, the principle is that in order to have free and fair elections, who is on the voter roll must be publicly known. That's the only way you prevent fraudulent voting. So, therefore, the RTI law recognized privacy, balanced it with right to information way before privacy gets recognized as a fundamental right. Now, let me just add to this one more point before I stop. Over the last 20 years, because see, the RTI Act came in 2005. Today, we are sitting in 2025. Over the last 20 years, there have been hundreds of High Court judgments, several Supreme Court judgments, including Constitution bench judgments which had the opportunity to examine Section 81J of the RTI Act. Very often they ruled in favor of not disclosing that information, but often they said that no, this information you should disclose under 81J. No court, no judge ever came to a finding that 81J is not adequate for protecting privacy. And this is a very important point. Even in the Puttasamy judgment, in which they actually uphold privacy to be a fundamental right, they examine Section 81J, they refer to it. They do not reach a conclusion that 81J is inadequate because even in Puttasamy, the judgment tells us that the way to balance two fundamental rights is through the proportionality test. They look at 81J, no one remarks that 81J is not adequate to protect privacy. So, therefore, the law already protected privacy. And in a sense, what this amendment has done, and which I think we'll be discussing now, is that it has completely destroyed this balance and simply given a blanket exemption to personal information. Now, Data Protection Act is basically to say that all of us have a lot of data. The collection and the use of that data should be properly regulated. There should not be unhindered collection of data, linking it to things, using it however you want. So the primary obligation on this falls over on those who are collecting large data. And actually, data protection is actually about big data, that companies that are dealing with large data sets, let's say the Facebooks, the Ubers, government agencies, right? Like in India, ration is provided to 80 crore people. So let's say the food ministry, election commission of India, the Aadhaar, the UIDAI, because they're again dealing with all people living in our country. So really the expectation of a data protection law is that you put stops and you put guardrails on those who are collecting and using this data. Instead, what we find in the Indian data protection law is that it actually fails, and it fails quite miserably in actually ensuring protection of people's data. And I'll explain that in a minute on how it does that. And on the other hand, the government has used it as a tool to actually go after the Right to Information Act, to take away key provisions of that, and also to restrict media freedoms. So one of the things, a global standard, and if you look at the European Union regulations on GDPR, it's one of the most stringent data protection laws. But even that says that media freedom cannot be curtailed in the name of data protection. Now, the way the data protection law has got framed in India is that it says that before publishing anyone's personal information or collecting it or analyzing it, you need their consent. There is no exemption for journalists at all. So does that mean that a journalist will have to go and ask a corrupt minister or a corrupt official that can I publish your name in my report? And obviously the answer is going to be no. Now let's look at what it has done to the Right to Information Act. I just explained that the Right to Information Act already recognized privacy and balanced it with the right to information. What the data protection law has done is that it has amended section 81J. So section 44(3) of the Data Protection Act amends section 81J, and they have done away with all the balancing and all the nuance of 81J. Now the Right to Information Act, after these amendments, simply reads as that information which relates to personal information shall henceforth not be disclosed. Now, what does that mean? That means any personal information will now not be given. Now, I have looked at thousands of RTIs. I myself would have filed hundreds and thousands of RTIs. And literally in every single RTI, some level of personal information is always asked for, because that is what leads to accountability. Let me give you a few examples. Let's say you apply for a passport or a ration card or a driving license, and the department is demanding a bribe for you. RTI has become a great tool for being able to say no to giving bribes and still getting your work done. So, one of the questions that people always ask under the RTI Act is that give the name of the official who is responsible for processing my application in time. Give the name of the official to whom I can make a complaint if a bribe is being asked for. Now we will be told this is personal information, we can't give it to you. Another key use of the Right to Information Act has been to pull out deliberations of government decision making. How did government arrive at a certain decision? The fact that the government has taken a decision, we all know. Government has decided demonetization, government has decided to introduce electoral bonds, government might decide something else tomorrow. How did you reach that decision? Who was in the room when those decisions were taken? Who did you consult with? Did you only speak to industry? Did you speak to citizens? Did you speak to representatives of citizens? So one of the key questions, so for instance, even if I look at the whole electoral bonds saga, a key element of the Supreme Court striking it down was that they looked at the deliberations between the RBI governor, the election commissioners, and also the finance ministry officials. Now, all of that came out through RTI. So we literally filed RTI saying that what are the meetings that you held? Who did you consult with? Give us a copy of the correspondence. Now, imagine now, after this data protection amendment, even if I get a copy of the correspondence and they have blackened out the name of the sender and the name of the receiver, how am I to make sense of it? How do I know when the government decided to bring those three farm laws against which we saw a nationwide stir of farmers? Did the government speak to farmers and farmers representatives body? Who was in that room? Who did you consult with? And these are key questions of accountability in a democracy, because in a democracy you have a right to even get into how did you arrive at a policy, who did you speak to. Now imagine being told no, we can't give that to you. Pick up another example. One of the key issues that has been coming up in our country is the hundreds and thousands of crores of loans that are given to people, which are then not repaid. And very often these people escape the country, and it's actually public exchequer which fills in the gap and puts in money to service these loans. Now, people have been asking under RTI, who are these people? And this case went right up to the Supreme Court, because initially the banks and RBI denied its citing privacy, and the Supreme Court said nothing doing. You have to give the names of loan defaulters that is related to public activity and public interest. Now, imagine we can't access that information. So, literally anything that leads to accountability. I mean, just look around. Every day we'll hear of some bridge falling somewhere, the roof of a school collapsing onto children, a road caving in. I want to know who is the contractor who made that building. Who is the safety inspector who said that, yes, I've inspected this and it is safe for people to sit under or to drive their car over? So, will I now be told that this is personal information? And this is where it shows that how sort of with a they've gone with a hammer on the RTI Act. It destroys the most. Okay, why do you need a right to information law? You need a right to information law in order to access information, to seek accountability from the government. And in order to seek accountability, a key question is the question of who. Who was there in the meeting? Who took this decision? Who gave this contract? And I think, in a sense, the government has been very, very strategic that in the name of data protection, they've done away with such a key element of the Right to Information Act. Let me explain another amendment that has been made to the Right to Information Act that is not so well understood and talked about. Now, the Right to Information Act listed under Section 8 from A to J the list of information that is to be exempt. Like I mentioned, national security, fiduciary relationship, and privacy.
Right.
At the end of 81J, there was a provision which said, provided that information which cannot be denied to Parliament or a state legislature shall not be denied to a citizen. In a sense, saying that a citizen and a member of Parliament have the same right to demand accountability from the government. And I think this is the core of democracy. The core of democracy is that we are all equal. We all have equal rights to seek accountability. So it's a core element saying the citizen is at par with a member of parliament when it comes to seeking accountability. They've done away with this section as well, even though there are so many rulings of high courts, and even the DOPT, the Department of Personnel's own handbook says that this proviso is applicable to the whole of Section 8 and not just 81J. So I think the government has very, very strategically, in the name of data protection, actually tried to shut down instruments of accountability. A, by amending the right to information law, and B, by actually going after the freedom of the media to report. Now, what I spoke of earlier, that when I said that the DPDP miserably fails to actually even protect privacy, is if you simply look at the number of rights that are given to the central government. It says central government can exempt any organization or even any single body from the application of the data protection law. So does that mean that tomorrow the government might allow its favorite companies, whether they be Jio, whether they be Adani or Airtel, to say, oh yes, you can collect all the information, use it however you want, without actually needing to follow the obligations of data protection? It says the government can exempt itself from the obligations of the data protection law. Now, the government is the biggest repository of people's personal data. And then if you have this level of arbitrary powers, I think even if you talk to people who advocate for privacy, who are privacy rights activists, and they've been writing about this consistently, they are saying that this law does not even protect privacy. So at the end of the day, we have a law where people are saying it does not protect privacy. We are explaining how it harms the right to information. You have media bodies explaining how it harms media rights. So who is it actually for? And that's why people have been saying that more than a data protection act, this is a corruption protection act that the government has
Right.
brought.
So this brings me to my next question, that the government is actually claiming that there is a very well-stricken balance between privacy and transparency. But do you think that that is sustained by any subparts of this ruling or any subsections in this act itself? Are there any actual practical parts and rules and practices within this act that substantiate their claim that there's a balance stricken between the two things, the privacy and transparency of this thing?
Actually, there is nothing that substantiates what the government is saying. So, therefore, unfortunately, the government is just making empty claims. In fact, it's at a point where, so we've been writing consistently to the government. Before the law came in, we kept trying to flag this, that look, don't amend the RTI law. After the law was passed in 2023, we've been saying that, look, don't operationalize Section 44(3) of the law yet. Please talk to people, talk to information commissioners, talk to people who are working on RTI, go back to even the debates around privacy. So, a few years ago, there was a committee headed by Justice Shah, which
Yes.
looked at the question of privacy and privacy rights. In that, he wrote explicitly, it's explicitly written that in the rush to protect privacy, we must not allow privacy to become a shield for corruption or a shield for evading public accountability. And therefore, the report says that neither the right to information nor media freedoms should be covered within the ambit of the data protection law. Unfortunately, this government is not engaging with people. Now, I know that this act went through an extensive deliberative process. It's been in the talk now for, I think, almost 8 years. I think since 2017, we've been looking at different versions of the law. The amendment that has come in this version of the law was actually not there in any of the versions of the law to this degree. There was a Justice Sri Krishna draft which actually tried to strike somewhat of a balance. We engaged with the Sri Krishna committee, we critiqued some of their provisions, but it did a better job of balancing it than what this particular law has done. If you look at the question of even media freedoms, none of the earlier iterations of the law actually included the media. They all had an explicit provision. The 2021 law had an explicit provision saying that nothing in this will apply to media, and yet that clause gets deleted. So I think it's a very, very deliberate attempt. And unfortunately, I have to say that, when the media has asked the government, because see, the government has not invited us for a single dialogue, even though we've written extensively to them. The National Campaign for People's Right to Information, I know that former information commissioners have written to them, retired judges have written to them, flagging these concerns. They've not invited anyone for a dialogue on this particular provision. And when the media has asked the minister, they just keep saying we are not amending the law. In fact, if you look at the exchange, there's an exchange that happened between Mr. Jairam Ramesh and Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav on this exact provision. So Mr. Jairam Ramesh wrote a letter to Mr. Vaishnav saying that please don't make these amendments, because even if you look at public accountability in welfare schemes, so let's say ration, pension, Narega, where thousands and thousands of crores are spent, and we know that corruption is a part of a lot of this. It is a part and parcel of any government scheme. And therefore, one of the ways to combat corruption is that you put in the public domain the details of all beneficiaries so that people know that, like, oh my God, you're giving ration in the name of a dead person, or, this person migrated 10 years ago. How are you still showing them? And the reply of Mr. Vaishnav was, we have not amended the RTI law. Now, how can you say you have not amended the RTI law when Section 44(3) explicitly amends the right to information law? I mean, in a sense, almost like saying we can't have a dialogue. Like, if I say the wall behind you is white and you say, no, it's actually pink, how do you have a dialogue from there? Because you're not even acknowledging the fact that, yes, you're amending the right to information law. And we actually tried to look at the statement of objects and reasons, that why are they amending the right to information law? And it's actually quite shocking that they have not been able to justify why they are amending the right to information law. And I believe this amendment is going to be challenged, and from many quarters it's going to be challenged. I mean, not just this amendment, I think the law is going to face some petitions in the Supreme Court, and I think certainly we are also looking at challenging this provision. I believe media might be looking at different challenges, and I think maybe privacy activists might be looking at it as well. I think the other thing that really, really surprised me is that if we look at the notification by which the law has been brought into force, so it's kind of, divided things into three categories. Things that are coming into force as of 13th November 2025, provisions that will come into force 1 year later, and provisions that will come into force 18 months later. Now, I understand and I appreciate why you need a staggered approach, because, in a sense, you need to have the infrastructure in place, give people the time to understand what this law means, do compliances, hire people, etc. But what really shocked me, and I think this, in a sense, tells you where the government, how it's thinking and what it wants to do. They have operationalized the amendment to the Right to Information Act in the first set, which means it's come into effect from 13 November 2025, even though the core of the data protection law will only come into force 18 months later. So Section 3 of the data protection law tells you who all does the law apply to. So in a sense, that's the core of the law, because see, you can set up a data protection board, you can do all of this, but till that time, that main provision, that what all does the data protection law apply to, till the time that doesn't come into force, you can't sort of use the data protection law. I would have thought they would have put the right to information amendment coming into force right at the end, because why do you want to touch an existing law and it's not even core to the implementing infrastructure? See, I can understand you need to set up a data protection board, hire people in it, start some awareness, some training, etc. Why amend the right to information law before you even are operationalizing the core provisions of the data protection law? And I think that shows you what the intention of the government is. The government has been finding the Right to Information Act to be very uncomfortable. We've seen how it has played a key role in exposing mega scams, with whether it's the electoral bond scam, which is the country's biggest scam, thousands and thousands of crores of quid pro quo, giving money, getting policy changed. whether it's the Vyapam scam, in which we see how entrance exam to medical colleges were completely fudged. There was impersonation, there was large scale cheating, large scale involvement of the top officials, including the governor of that time, whose name came up in the investigation, and his son. Whether you look at the Adarsh Housing Society scam, where houses meant for Kargil widows were all taken over by mantris and by babus, high-ranking army officials. The brigadier of army was arrested. Two brigadiers of the army were arrested. Major generals were arrested. I think the RTI has been a thorn in the side of the government, not just this government, earlier governments as well. So anyone who's in power, but I think this government has, in a sense, been planning how do you undermine the right to information law. They know that they can't repeal the law, there'll be too much public outrage, it will be very embarrassing, and therefore over a period of time they've been doing very, very strategic amendments. In 2019 they amended the law to take away the autonomy of information commissions, and now they've hit at the core provision which is used for public accountability, which is the clause where privacy and right to information were well balanced. Now they've given a blanket exemption in the name of privacy to all personal information.
Since we're talking about the privacy provisions under this law, I would want you to also tell me about how far is this act that has now been pushed into action, that is now being implemented in full force. How far is it from the original ruling that brought about the debate about the right to privacy of Indian citizens?
Yeah, so in a sense, the Puttaswamy judgment, which upheld privacy to be a fundamental right, that kind of laid out a framework saying that how should you look at fundamental rights, especially competing interests. And therefore, they explain that, look, there's a proportionality test. Even in the electoral bond case, the proportionality test came up for discussion because the government kept arguing that it is the privacy of donors which should override the right to information of voters. And the Supreme Court said that no, there is the right to information of voters is far more fundamental to a democracy than the privacy of donors. Now, if we look at the way the law is framed right now, to my mind, it doesn't qualify the tests laid out in the Puttaswamy judgment because, like I said, that it has given complete and arbitrary powers to the central government. I mean, let's just pick up one aspect of the law and try to break it down from there. So, this law has the Data Protection Board, which is kind of like the overall regulatory body, and which has the right to, which has the duty to ensure compliance with the provisions of the law. It's also the appellate body, it's where appeals will go, etc. This body has the right to impose penalties of up to 250 crores, a huge quantum of penalty. Now, one would imagine that a body like this should be functioning in a manner that's independent of the executive. Why? Because, to my mind, given the fact that the government is the biggest repository of data, a lot of complaints that you will get will be against the executive itself, right? So, someone writing to the government saying that, look, I gave my data to SBI, State Bank of India shared it in an unauthorized fashion, or saying that, look, my ration data has been shared in an unauthorized fashion. So, a lot of complaints that you're going to get will be against the executive. And yet, if you look at the law, there's not even an iota, I would say there's not even a pretense of independence. Whereas earlier versions of the law had a proper selection committee, had a balanced selection committee. There were also voices of the opposition on that selection committee. Over here, the government has written that the law says the central government will appoint chairperson and members of the board. The central government will decide the strength of the board. Central government will decide the powers of the board. So, how does this? I mean, just look at this one provision. I think on this provision itself, one can really critique the law and say that if this is a body which is looking at overall implementation of the law, and a key, the biggest, I think, number of complaints are likely to come up against the executive itself, is this body fit and is this body insulated adequately to be able to give rulings on that? And just go back to, let's say, the 2023 judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of the appointment of election commissioners. What did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court said that, look, a body which has to take action against another body should be adequately insulated from that body. Now, how are you insulating the Data Protection Board? I think, again, the wide ranging powers that the government has kept for itself to exempt itself, to exempt companies. And the interesting thing, and this is something that I was discussing with lawyers who work on issues of privacy. So, usually, when you do exemptions, you might do exemptions for a class of organizations, which means you might say that, okay, let's say every pharmaceutical company or every company engaged in pharmaceutical industry will be provided an exemption, because then you're exempting a class of industry. You're recognizing that maybe certain industries need a little bit of extra protection. In the law, the way it's framed, the government can literally grant exemptions to a single company, which means that even within telecom, they might grant it to the company which is its biggest donor and not give the same protection to other companies which are in the same sphere. I think, to my mind, it's like this is what is actually called manifest arbitrariness, where you've kept so many arbitrary powers for yourself when you are the biggest data collector and data repository, and on top of that to give yourself this level of power. Now let's look at media again. There is no exemption for the media. Government, the government, so the Editors Guild and the Press Club of India, along with 22 other press bodies and DigiPub, etc., wrote to the government saying, look, we're very concerned about how this law doesn't recognize media rights. The government, and this was the secretary, Mr. Krishnan of METI, actually invited the journalists for a dialogue. And he tried to tell them, don't worry, this doesn't cover you. They said, no, but that's not what the law says. So, an oral assurance from you today is not going to protect us tomorrow when the law becomes operational. So he actually told the media that, why don't you give us a set of concerns and questions that you have, and we will respond to that, almost like a FAQ. Now, even though we all understand that a FAQ has no power of law, but still the journalists felt that, look, this is an important way to engage with the government. They actually sent an FAQ. And just last night, I read a statement by the Press Club by the Editors Guild of India, saying that even though we sent questions to the government has not even bothered responding to our questions. Now, given the fact that the government has this arbitrary power, maybe tomorrow the government will exempt its favorite media channels, which it feels only propagates its point of view, and might not grant the same protection to investigative journalists or those asking tough questions. Now, imagine a journalist predicament. I mean, imagine your own predicament. Imagine the predicament of, let's say, the journalist in Chhattisgarh, Mukesh Chandrakar, who was exposing corruption in the construction of the road and eventually was, in fact, murdered for it. Just the chilling impact of it, that when you're putting pen to paper and you're going over this in your head, that, oh my God, do I have all the consent in place? Am I sure I've not violated the data protection law? It has penalties of up to 250 crore. I mean, forget 250 crore, even a penalty of 50 lakh, 60 lakh on a journalist working in a smaller town who doesn't have the backing of a large media organization which can hire the top lawyers. You're not going to report. You will not tell us anything. So let's say, look at the whole Morbi bridge tragedy that happened in Gujarat, where a bridge on which there were 150 people, it collapsed. And I think 142 people, including children and women, died in that. What did finally investigations by the media showed? They showed that the contract was given to a company which makes filaments for bulbs for maintenance of the bridge. It had no experience of large infrastructure. Now, who's the director of that company? Did that company give money to the ruling party? Is that why the basic safety was not done? Who were the safety auditors? What was the name of the safety inspector? As a journalist, you will really think hard about whether you should reveal all of this, because you'll actually have to go and ask the contractor that, can I write your name? Can I say that you were the person in charge of this? And I think, to my mind, to answer your question, I don't think it meets the standards laid out. I mean, I think it doesn't meet the standards laid out, not just in that judgment, but even on other judgment which say how a law should be, which has a regulatory body, what is the level of independence, what is the level of arbitrary powers that the government can enjoy.
So, what you're telling us here also sounds a lot like government overreach. And under that, I want you to tell me that what do you think are the risks of government overreach, especially regarding the exclusions and notifications that powers under the DPDP Act?
Yeah, so I think the risk of government overreach is very clear that it will be exercised in a very arbitrary manner.
Hmm.
The favorites will get all sorts of favors and free passes, and those who are not their favorites, whether because they're raising uncomfortable questions or maybe because they haven't given adequate donations to the ruling party, will not get those favors. In a sense, we might almost see a rent seeking opportunity being created for the party in power, saying that, look, if you do this, then yeah, maybe we'll give you a clearance. And what I'm saying is not something so out of this world that it's like, oh my God, what are you talking about? This is exactly what we saw in the electoral bond case,
Right.
that give a donation, get the policy change, give a donation, get a contract. So A, it opens up the door for rent seeking. B, it's completely arbitrary. And C, which is the most crucial, it doesn't protect citizens' rights. Why did we need a data protection law? The data protection law is not a government protection law.
Hmm.
It's a right accrued to citizens to have control over their data. Now, if instead of giving me that control, you've given the government that control, government will do what it likes. And there are so many examples of this. I mean, that whole story came out through investigative reporters on how the motor vehicle data was all sold off to a private company.
Right.
So how government will share data with companies at different states. So it's not, at the end of the day, in the name of data protection, you're not actually empowering the citizen, you're empowering yourself. And I think another key provision which gives this away is the fact that they've got a penalty on a complainant if the
Hmm.
complaint is found to be false, etc. Now, I might make a complaint because I believe something has happened. I may not have the full facts.
Hmm.
Why are you threatening me with a complaint? I mean, close the complaint, right? Like, why do you need to threaten me? Then I'll be thinking, oh my God, do I have all my facts right? I hope it's right. I don't even know, who to complain against. So, for instance, today in the morning also, I got a recorded phone call from one of these companies. I
Hmm.
don't know who to file the complaint against. So, I might try to, do it to the best of my efforts. If you're going to say that there might even be a penalty on you, most people would not reach. Again, look at the provisions. The data protection board is a single body for the whole nation. Like,
Uh,
what happens? Yeah.
Before you go further, I would also want you to add here that what communities and what segments of the society, of our Indian society for that matter, would be largely affected by this, positively or negatively, who benefits from this, and which communities are actually going to pay the price of this act actually coming into action.
So I think that's difficult to sort of predict at this stage. I think the actions of the government in the coming future will reveal a lot. But certainly all those people who were using right to information to ask questions and to seek accountability. And our research shows that every year about 6 million RTA applications are filed. And
Hmm.
a majority of them are actually filed by the poorest and the most marginalized because they're most dependent on government services. So, for instance, if in the government hospital the doctor is not coming or the X-ray machine is not working, you or I might have the privilege of saying, forget the government hospital, let's go to a private hospital, take our kid there. But someone who's living at the margins doesn't have that choice if the teacher is not coming to the government school. And unfortunately, it's all of these questions of give a copy of the attendance register of the teacher, who is the doctor in charge over here, which will also now be denied in the name of data protection. So I think all of those who seek government accountability using the Right to Information Act, whether they are driven by trying to resolve some personal issue which affects them, or there are people demanding this information in public interest, that names of contractors, name of loan defaulters. I mean, even look at something like the special intensive revision. The Supreme Court had to come down heavily on the Election Commission to say that you have to put the list of deleted people, 65 lakh people, with their addresses and the reason for deletion in the public domain. That's the only way the truth will come out. And the moment that data was published, we saw lakhs of instances of wrongful deletions and wrongful additions. People who were dead were shown to be alive. People who were alive were shown to be dead. You had that dramatic happening in the Supreme Court where two people said we've been declared dead, but we are alive. So even the Supreme Court said that, and the Election Commission kept on arguing privacy. And the Supreme Court said that no, this is not a question of privacy, this is a question of public accountability. You have to put that list in the public domain. So I think we're going to see everyone who seeks government accountability. In fact, I would say not even everyone who seeks. Maybe I'm the person who files an RTI, but that information might be impacting all of us. For instance, if I file an RTI today asking that who is in charge of ensuring that the air quality monitoring stations are working properly in Delhi, I might be the one asking that question, but it's going to impact every single person living in Delhi. So I think, in a sense, every citizen is going to get impacted by the amendment made to the Right to Information Act.
We are also seeing judiciary as a safeguard against this new act and how RTI will be viewed under it, the way this will be then used or utilized in public domain. I also want to understand, are there other safeguards remaining, for example, in the original RTI Act, the Section 8 subsection 2, and how functional are these laws and safeguards under the new regime, under the DPDP Act?
Yeah, so Section 8.2 said that even if something is exempt under Section 8.1, if you can prove that the public interest in disclosure is greater than the harm to the protected interest, then that information can be released. Now, the government is going and saying that, oh, look, there's a public interest test in 8.2 also, therefore nothing impacts RTI. In a sense, almost saying that the public interest test under 8.1J was redundant, which is a completely wrong thing to say. You can talk to any legal expert. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I've had the opportunity to work very closely with lawyers over the last 2 decades. The presumption always is that in a law, no section is redundant. Every section has a role that it plays. Look at the wording of the public interest test in 8.1J and look at the wording of the public interest test in 8.2. In 8.2, the public information officer has no discretion. It says the public authority may disclose. Whereas in 8.1J, if the public information officer, which means the first person who I interact with through my RTI, if that person felt that, yes, this is personal information, but there is public interest or it's connected to public activity, it should be disclosed, then they would have disclosed it. So to say that we've not amended RTI, 8.2 is still there. Are you trying to suggest that all the other words in 8.1J that you've deleted were useless? That's a huge proposition to put forth, to say that a law had words which were not needed. I think the government is again trying to sort of play it smart and try and, the government has the ability to propagate its message to crores of people. And therefore, if they say, oh, these people are fooling you, 8.2 is there, we've not amended the RTI law. No, the facts are you have amended the RTI law. Yes, 8.2 is there, but the test in 8.2 is far more difficult to cross than in 8.1J. And the most important thing is that the RTI law earlier only exempted a subset of personal information, that which had nothing to do with public activity or interest, or that which would cause unwarranted invasion of privacy. They've done away with all of this, and they're saying 8.2 is enough. 8.2 is not enough. And if your proposition is that you have not amended the RTI law, well, I don't know what to say to you, because 44.3 actually directly amends the RTI law. We are living in difficult times where honestly you can't have a dialogue if, like I said, that the government comes out saying we are not even amending the law.
Right. So, talking about the DPDP Act as it is, it also gives, like you mentioned earlier, that it also gives the government a lot of autonomy over the private information or the personal information of a lot of people, like the likes of you and I. It gives them a lot more control, a lot more access into our private lives, right? So, I also want to understand that. Are there any specific concerns about the surveillance or national security based on the government's access to personal data under this new regime?
Yeah, I think that I have read a lot of commentary by groups and activists and lawyers working on issues of privacy who have commented extensively on this. Sort of, they are far better placed to comment on this, but let me just talk about one section of the law. So there is Section 36 of the Data Protection Law. Very interesting. And maybe if the text of that could be shown. So it basically says that the central government can ask for any data fiduciary to reveal any information and hand over any information that it wants. Now that's almost like a unchecked power of the government to demand absolutely anything. And the way the law is framed is that even you and I are becoming data fiduciaries, because data fiduciaries are not just organizations. So for instance, I'm sure, because you're a journalist, I'm sure you have a broadcast list of 500, 600 people. Like now that you have my number, you might put me on your broadcast list. I'll keep getting updates from you. You might have an email list, etc. So you are a data fiduciary. What is the government saying? The government is saying that now we can ask any data fiduciary to reveal any information to us. There are no safeguards. It doesn't say that insofar as it pertains to violations of the law. It doesn't say insofar as it relates to questions of national security or it relates to issues of public order or something. It's just an unchecked arbitrary power. And this is just one clause of the law that I'm talking about. So I think it's going to be very, very problematic. In fact, I pulled up section 36. It says the central government may, for the purposes of this act, require the board and any data fiduciary or intermediary to furnish such information as it may call for. So tomorrow they might say, give us your phone and your password. We want to look at something. No safeguards. In fact, I was talking to some people who work on issues of civil liberties, and they were saying even the surveillance laws have greater safeguards than this. So tomorrow they might say, okay, give us your Gmail password. We want to go through all your emails. There's nothing over here which says, so literally, I mean, the wording is any information may require them to furnish such information that it may call for. There's nothing to say that in the interest of national security or in a particular case or for a particular thing. They're saying anything that they can ask for. And I think all of the cases that the Supreme Court is even dealing with right now, like I know that the Supreme Court is looking at one case over how does the government take digital devices of journalists? What are the safeguards? Because ultimately journalists, lawyers, doctors, all of them work in a fiduciary capacity. For instance, a whistleblower might be in touch with you, revealing very, very sensitive documents and saying that please keep my identity hidden. Now, let's say you're doing a story on it, government gets wind of it, uses this law to say, come and show us your phone and tell us who's giving you this information. There are people whose profession requires a level of protection from government, that requires a level of fiduciary relationship. And I think all of that is getting completely destroyed through this law.
So, do you see any potential reforms under this law coming? Do you see any amendments that would better strike a balance between the privacy concerns that journalists or activists or even general citizens of India might have in, preserving the democratic rights and the democratic transparency that the government, as a democracy, guarantees its citizens?
So we had actually suggested, because when it was becoming clear that they're not dialoguing on any of these aspects, we had suggested just two small and key amendments to the law. We had said, look, drop the amendments that you're making to the RTI law, it's not needed, and insert one provision saying that nothing in this law will apply to journalists and those in the media profession. So basically saying that provide an exemption for journalistic purposes. And this is the global standard. This is the standard followed in other countries. This would have at least ensured that the question of public accountability and transparency gets protected. There would still be questions over privacy, but that could have been dealt with within the rules, within the law. But at least these two things, so deleting the amendments made to RTI, so don't amend the RTI, and second, that give an explicit safeguard for journalistic work. At least these two would have helped save and safeguard the democratic principles of accountability, transparency, and a free press. A free press is crucial to the survival of a democracy. It's not for nothing that it's called the fourth pillar. I think the government has not been open to any suggestions or amendments. In fact, I recall, and this is something that maybe you could look into deeper and even tell your viewers about it. that the select committee that was working on this bill, the final version of the bill was not even shown to the select committee. And members of the select committee wrote letters saying that we have no idea. They came to us and they said, give your approval. And when they said, at least show us the draft, the government refused to show the draft. And then the government said, okay, we'll just go by majority vote. And because in 2023, the government had a humongous majority, they just passed it through the select committee like that. Now, again, look at when did this law get passed in parliament. Opposition members had walked out over the violence happening in Manipur. All those videos that had come out of women being paraded naked, the kind of violence reports that were coming out, opposition members had walked out because they were saying, forget everything else, please look at what's happening to our brothers and sisters in Manipur, let us debate that. They'd done a staged walkout. While the opposition is not in the house, the government brings this bill and passes it. There's no discussion. There's no, critical point of view. There's no debate. A law like this should have been debated extensively for several weeks. Parliamentary proceedings are broadcast. Citizenry would have had a chance to understand. Maybe some people would have put forth these points of views. Government would have responded. Nothing. So you pass it at a time when the opposition has walked out over Manipur.
Right. This brings me to my last question to you and to the end of our interview today. What advice would you give to citizens and journalists, like me and other people, trying to work within this new legal environment, and what strategies or priorities should they focus on at this point?
Yeah, I think people need to take legal advice. I think people need to understand how to operate within this new framework. I don't have any easy, ways on how do you tackle this, especially for investigative journalists, because their work requires a level of sort of, I mean, so many times journalists go undercover and, don't even reveal who they are and pretend to be someone else, because that's part of the job. And those are special privileges that a journalist enjoys. For instance, I can't pretend to be someone else and talk to government officials. I'd be jailed for it. But you could do that because that you do have protected rights as a media person. So I really don't have any easy solutions. I would say that work with courage and, sort of do try and understand the law, seek some legal opinion, seek some legal assistance. There's a lot of information in the public domain in Hindi, in English, in local languages. Try and access that material. And I think also maybe get in touch with your representative bodies like Editors Guild, Press Club, maybe jointly think of what to do. And as far as citizens are concerned, I think we all also need to become aware of more than our rights. What are the risks and liabilities of this law? And for all of those who use the RTI law, I would say that keep using it extensively. It doesn't matter if the government is denying information, because the RTI is really that one important tool which really holds this this democracy accountable to us. And even if they're denying information, the very act of filing an RTI is such a powerful act where your intention is to seek accountability. And I think it's going to frustrate the question of public accountability, whatever gains have been made, and even questions like the functioning of primary health dispensaries, local hospitals, local schools through the RTI law, all of those are going to take a hit. But I think people need to continue to be strong, because it's actually people who fought for the RTI law, people who demanded the law, people who safeguarded it against amendments, people who use it. And I think eventually the solution will only come from people speaking out and saying that we don't think that this is the right way forward.
Thank you so much for speaking to us at Newsreel Asia today. This was a very holistic overview into what is actually going on and how we as citizens need to be aware of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.